Institute and School of Social Sciences and Humanities for making this event happen. And of course, thanks to Professor Nathan Brown for taking this trip from Washington, D.C. to here. Tonight we're going to talk about Americans and the Middle East under Trump. So the main slogan of Trump, "Make America Great Again." We pose the question for who? Make America great again, for everyone, for some people, for some Americans. And in the place, for example, I found that many Americans in a poll conducted by the Associated Press Times Square Alliance, that many Americans are more hopeful that the 2017 will be much better than 2016. So the poll released just after the elections showed that 55% of Americans think that 2017 will be better than 2016. And at the same time, I was impressed to find these different, the polarization that is happening right now in the American society with regard to Trump. So, and this is quite clear in the letters sent to the editor in the different newspapers, in the comments we find on news stories about Trump election and Trump winning the election. So one of them is saying that, quote, "Next year will be better than this year because people will have more jobs and they will have more money to spend." While we have someone else who didn't actually, he said that he didn't vote for any of them, for Hillary Clinton or for Donald Trump. But he said that Trump would turn out to be a better president than the press thinks. And he said, "I'm thrilled that Mr. Trump beat the mainstream press, which dropped all pretense of neutrality this year in order to save us from a monster. Along with other elites in both parts, you are glum today. It's delicious." So how do you see this polarization in the American society would produce in the next 4 years with regard to emerging like social movements to happen in the American society, with the change that is going on in the major two parts, with many calls calling for other parts to compete in the elections and to get the opportunity to be part of this equation. And also, the second part of our guest talk tonight will be about how the winning of Trump will represent a historic break in the relations with the Middle East in general. Thank you so much, and the stage is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Aid, who's an old friend from his days at George Washington University when he studied with us and taught many of our students. And thank you very much to the Doha Institute for having me here. The topic is one of my own choosing. American Middle East policy in the age of Trump. What is American Middle East policy likely to look like under Trump? And an honest answer would be a very short one. I don't know. But I would have to fill up the rest of the time with something. So what I will fill it up with is speculation. Speculation about what a Trump administration will look like in policy terms for the, especially for the Middle East. There are some ways that I can approach this topic. There are many different ways to approach this topic, but I thought what would be most appropriate, since I'm coming from Washington, would be to focus on how it looks from the perspective of an American foreign policy process that is based in Washington. There are aspects of this subject that I won't address in my formal remarks, but I'm happy to try and address them to the best that I can in the discussion. I won't be addressing, for instance, why it is that Trump won. I won't be doing that partly because I don't have any particular insight, but also because I have a sense when I read the instant analysis that is done is that it tends to overreact to a Trump victory. It's important to recognize, for instance, that his opponent got 3 million more, almost 3 million more votes than he did. So to explain an electoral outcome as if it was a very strong switch in American voting patterns doesn't necessarily make sense. I think it will take a while before we understand exactly what happened in the elections and why. Nor will I explain it in comparative perspective. I think that there is certainly something that is afoot in many political systems throughout the world, a rise in right-wing populism, and in some ways, Trump looks, and the Trump phenomenon looks familiar. And there are probably some interesting comparative notes that could be the topic for discussion. When I look at the Trump phenomenon, what strikes me is that in opposition or in distinction to many of those other right-wing populist movements, Trump himself is very much an individual. He certainly is drawing on themes and movements and organizations outside of himself. But at this point, he is as much the producer of his victory as those movements are. And so it seems to me a little bit, again, premature to focus on this only as an example of a global phenomenon of right-wing populism. And finally, I will say I am not going to give you my own normative evaluation of Trump, what I think of him. Some of that will become clear in some of my remarks, but I will try to be much more analytical than I will be evaluative or normative in my remarks. What I'm going to try and do is four things. First, explain why it is, I think, unusually difficult to forecast American policy under the Trump presidency. Why it is that the answer, I don't know, may be the best answer. But second, I'm going to then try and say, what is it that we do know, or what kind of tendencies do we clearly see from those that emerged in Trump's campaign? Then third, I'm going to try and look at foreign policy and comparison to domestic policy. In some ways, I expect the major break to come out and to express itself more easily in domestic policy than in foreign policy, and I will explain why. And then finally, I will take a look at the Middle East and take a look at specific issue areas and speculate how it is that a Trump administration might handle those differently from its predecessors. So first, why is it so difficult to talk about what a Trump administration would look like? It is normal at the time of a transition in the presidency in the United States to speculate, but usually the speculation is based on far sounder and richer set of sources. Candidates are products of campaigns. They issue lengthy policy statements, develop long policy positions. Political leaders get associated with certain kinds of ideas, principles, and ideological tendencies. They bring with them a group of people, usually with deep political experience and with their own political records to draw on. And so by the time that they are elected, at least some of the options and some of the basic directions of policy are clear. This Trump presidency is starting out very, very different. First, there is Trump himself, who certainly has expressed himself on policy questions, but in sometimes an extraordinarily unhelpful way. I'm going to say this quite directly. I don't think that there has ever been anybody elected to the presidency who places so little value on truth and consistency. That, in other words, he lies, he changes his mind, he says what he didn't, he denies that what he said yesterday he actually said. And I'm not saying that in order to condemn him, I'm saying that in order to explain why it's very, very difficult with an individual like this to forecast exactly what they will do in office. He does not seem bound by his previous pronouncements. It's also the fact, I think, that he expresses himself sometimes in such a pugnacious and such an outrageous way that it's easy to be distracted by the words. There's something about the way that he expresses himself that if you do not agree with him, and many people do not, you find yourself reacting more with frustration than with an ability to try and analyze what lies behind the comments. In foreign and security policy, there's the absolutely extraordinary fact that Trump got elected against, or in spite of the opposition of virtually the entire foreign policy establishment. People who had served in past Democratic and Republican administrations most of them would have nothing to do with this presidential campaign. And so he does not come in with a circle of people around him who are well known and whose policy records are well known. And those whom he has brought in since the election are extraordinarily diverse. He has brought in, for instance, a Secretary of Defense who is a very recently retired general. To bring in somebody that is essentially from the establishment is an odd thing for an anti-establishment candidate to do. At the same time, he's brought in a Secretary of State who has no direct foreign policy experience whatsoever. His experience is entirely in the private sector. International experience, yes, to be sure, but no policy experience, and no experience working in government. He has brought in a national security advisor who, although he comes out of the military and out of an intelligence background, since he left that, expresses himself in public in ways that sound, I'm trying to think of a neutral word for this, but in ways that sound undisciplined. I think Islamophobic is not unfair, and sometimes just loosely based in reality. And this is somebody whose position it will be to coordinate national security policy. And that's simply in foreign policy. If I were to go to domestic policy, I could come up with a similar list of very, very diverse people. And that makes it much more difficult. Finally, I would say that there's never been a president who has come in who has presented himself so forcefully as the anti-establishment candidate. Most candidates run successfully for president do not present themselves as the candidate of Washington. They try to present themselves as candidates who are coming from outside of Washington, even if they've lived and worked in the city for a long time. But never has a presidential candidate come in who has been so consistent and so forceful and so disrespectful to the nation's institutions, including the military, the intelligence apparatus, and so on. And yet the United States is a country with a series of fairly strong formal institutions. I said that at the beginning I wouldn't engage in comparative analysis, and I won't for the most part. But what I will say here, that in some ways a little bit of the flavor of this transition has less to do, or it resembles less previous transitions in American history, and a little more of the flavor of Egyptian politics from 2011 to 2013, when you had a series of strong institutions dealing with a set of popular forces that they were not used to have to dealing with. In Egypt, I would say the forces of the institutions, what sometimes people refer to as the deep state, seem to have ultimately triumphed. It is not clear to me that where the outcome of a president who is, as I say, so disrespectful to American institutions and to some strong traditions of governance, whether he will be able to really reshape those institutions or whether they will wind up reshaping him. So those are some of the reasons that I think it's a little bit difficult to analyze and explain what Trump is likely to bring. Let me then turn to my second topic. What is it that we can say about Trump? Because although he does not seem to have a very strong ideology, and although he does not seem to have a very strong set of policy positions developed outside of a very few signature issues, such as on immigration, he is somebody who has a very, very strong personality. And what is that personality likely to bring to the policy realm? Well, here he shows some consistent themes, not an ideology and not a program, but a certain way of approaching the political world, and especially international questions. A first element in this is referred to by my colleague Mark Lynch, what he calls belligerent belligerent minimalism, which sounds like an odd combination. It is belligerent in the sense that he expresses himself in extremely strong and extremely undiplomatic language, regularly threatens the use of force by way of tweets in a way that is, I think, unprecedented in international affairs, and yet at the same time seems to have a very, very sharply nationalistic view of American interests, and one that is, I think, a sharp turn away from much of the internationalism that has colored an awful lot of American foreign policy in basically since the Second World War. He is probably the least internationalist president in about a century or so. And this is, again, sort of a very, very odd combination. In a sense, he constantly threatens the use of military force, but doesn't seem to be able to identify a single international issue in which sustained use of military force, that is, commitment of American ground forces, would be one where he would see that as the solution. A second element, I think, of Trump's presentation, his personality as affects international affairs, is what is sometimes referred to as a very transactional approach. If you listen to him recently, for instance, on how he has explained the issue of, or his promise to build a wall between the United States and Mexico and make Mexico pay for it, he explains it this way. There's a whole series of measures that he will bring up in the American-Mexican relationship, many of them having to do with immigration and many of them having to do with trade. And he views these as ones that will be handled comprehensively. And as he, in essence, threatens the Mexicans on trade issues, they will be more forthcoming on immigration issues. And his promise, essentially, is that they will pay for the construction of a wall or barrier between the United States and Mexico as part of an overall bilateral arrangement. I mean, this is extraordinary on many, many different levels, okay? But most of which are too obvious to state. But there's one thing that you might miss that I think does deserve attention. This is a view of the issues of immigration and of trade, very important international issues, strictly in bilateral terms. They are issues between the United States and Mexico to be handled only between the United States and Mexico. Since the Second World War, the United States has been involved in the construction of a whole series of multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or of international treaties, the North America Free Trade Agreement. And in essence, what the United States has done, and this is what I meant when I said it was a very international approach, was to take upon itself the role of structuring international relations on a multilateral basis. And certainly there's plenty of room for bilateral diplomacy within that, but it is carried on within structures and agreements and principles and ways of doing things, and is in essence an American ordered world. And Trump seems to want to handle relationships with individual countries on a case-by-case basis. So what happens with Mexico is what happens with Mexico. And you put aside all of the international trade regimes, you put aside all elements pretty